The carriage wheels struck the cobblestones outside the grand hall, and Julian's hands were shaking before he even stepped out. Tonight was the night he had feared for months, the night the entire city would gather under one roof, and he had made a decision he could not undo. He had left his wife behind. Julian Ashcombe was a duke, a man whose name opened every door in the kingdom, but tonight, his pride had made a choice that would haunt him. His wife, Elena, was somewhere far from this glittering hall, unaware that the most important event of the season was happening without her. Julian told himself it was for the best. He told himself she would not understand the customs of high society, that her quiet manner and plain dresses would embarrass him in front of people who mattered. He told himself many things that night, and none of them were kind. Beside him sat Camille, a woman known throughout the city for her sharp tongue and sharper beauty. She wore a gown the color of dark wine, and her laugh carried through the carriage like a bell. Julian had asked her to accompany him only 2 days before, a decision made in a moment of panic when he realized he could not face the ball alone, and he certainly would not bring the woman he had married in secret, the woman whose background he had never bothered to fully understand. "You seem nervous," Camille said, studying him with curious eyes. A duke should never look nervous. "I am simply tired," Julian answered, though the truth sat heavy in his chest. The carriage stopped, and footmen in crisp uniforms opened the doors. Julian stepped down first, offering his hand to Camille, as though she were the only woman in his life. The moment their feet touched the marble steps leading into the hall, dozens of eyes turned toward them. Whispers began instantly, the way they always did when a duke appeared with a woman who was not his wife. Inside, the hall was ablaze with candlelight. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, and the walls were lined with paintings of ancestors long since passed. Musicians played softly in one corner, while servants moved through the crowd carrying trays of refreshments. It was the kind of gathering that defined a person's place in society, the kind where a single misstep could ruin a reputation for years. Julian greeted the host, an elderly baron with a booming voice, and forced a smile as introductions were made. Every person he spoke with glanced past him, searching for the woman they had heard so much about, but had never actually seen. The Duchess of Ashcombe had become something of a mystery in recent months, a name mentioned often, but a face known to almost no one. "Where is your wife tonight, Your Grace?" asked Lady Winslow, a woman whose curiosity was matched only by her love of gossip. Julian's jaw tightened. "She is unwell," he said smoothly, the lie slipping from his lips with practiced ease. "A small fever, nothing serious. She sends her regrets." Lady Winslow's eyes narrowed slightly, though she said nothing more. She simply nodded and moved on to whisper with her companions the moment Julian turned away. The truth was far different from what Julian claimed. Elena was not ill. She was not even aware that this ball was taking place. Julian had never sent word of the invitation, had never mentioned it in passing, had made certain she remained at their country estate while he traveled to the city alone. It was easier that way, he told himself. Easier to protect his reputation. Easier to avoid the questions that would surely follow if people learned the truth about how quiet and unassuming his wife truly was. Camille moved through the crowd beside him with practiced grace, greeting old friends and accepting compliments on her appearance. She seemed to enjoy the attention, seemed to relish being seen on the arm of a duke, even though both of them understood this was merely an arrangement of convenience. Camille had her own reasons for accepting his invitation, reasons that had little to do with affection, and much to do with the doors such an arrangement might open for her in the future. As the evening progressed, the ballroom filled with more guests, more laughter, more clinking of glasses. Julian found himself relaxing slightly, believing perhaps that he had made the right choice after all. No one seemed to suspect anything unusual. No one seemed to question why the Duke's wife was never present at any public event. He allowed himself to enjoy a moment of ease, dancing with Camille under the golden light, forgetting for a while the woman waiting at home who had no idea her husband was pretending she did not exist. But pride, as Julian would soon learn, has a way of catching up with those who wear it too proudly. Far from the city, at the modest but comfortable estate where Elena lived, a letter arrived that evening, carried by a tired messenger who had traveled a long distance. Elena sat by the window, reading quietly, when the housekeeper brought it to her, her expression calm as always, though something about the seal on the envelope caught her attention immediately. It was from her grandmother. the Dowager Countess Margaret Beaumont, a woman known throughout the kingdom for her sharp wit and even sharper intellect. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she opened the letter, for her grandmother rarely wrote unless something important needed to be said. "My dear Elena," the letter began, "I find myself unwell and wish to see you before the season grows too cold to travel comfortably. Please come to the city as soon as you are able. There are matters we must discuss, matters concerning your future and the family name you carry, though perhaps do not yet fully understand." Elena read the letter twice, her heart tightening with worry. Her grandmother had never been a woman prone to exaggeration, and if she claimed to be unwell, there was likely truth to it. Elena did not hesitate. She called for her carriage to be prepared and began packing a small bag, determined to leave for the city before the night grew too late. She had no knowledge of the grand ball taking place that very evening. She had no knowledge that her husband was there, laughing and dancing with another woman, while claiming she herself was too sick to attend anything at all. Elena's mind was occupied only with concern for her grandmother, a woman who had raised her after her parents passed away, a woman who had taught her patience, grace, and quiet strength, even in the face of hardship. As Elena settled into the carriage, the driver flicked the reins, and the horses began their journey toward the city, under a sky scattered with stars. She rested her head against the window, watching the countryside blur into darkness, unaware that her arrival would collide with the very event her husband had hoped to keep hidden from her entirely. Back at the ball, Julian had grown comfortable enough to forget his earlier nervousness. He stood near the refreshment table with Camille, discussing matters of little importance, when a sudden shift in the atmosphere of the room caught his attention. The musicians paused their playing. The chatter around him softened into a low murmur. Even the servants seemed to pause mid-step, as though something significant was about to happen. Julian turned toward the grand entrance, curiosity mixing with a strange sense of unease that he could not yet explain. A footman near the doorway cleared his throat and announced, in a voice loud enough for the entire hall to hear, the arrival of a guest, whose name Julian had not expected to hear that evening. The words seemed to hang in the air, echoing off the high ceilings, freezing every conversation in the room. Her Grace, Elena Ashcombe, Duchess of Ashcombe. For a moment, Julian could not move. He stood frozen, near the refreshment table, his glass still in hand, his mind refusing to accept what his ears had just heard. Surely this was a mistake. Surely there had been some confusion. Elena was supposed to be at the estate, far away, unaware of anything happening in the city tonight. But as he turned fully toward the entrance, his eyes met the unmistakable figure standing at the top of the grand staircase, dressed simply, yet elegantly, her posture calm and composed, despite the hundreds of eyes now fixed upon her. It was Elena, and she had just walked into the one place Julian had hoped she would never see him. The room fell into complete silence, save for the soft rustle of gowns and the quiet shuffle of feet as guests turned to stare at the woman they had heard so much about, but had never actually laid eyes on. Whispers began almost immediately, spreading through the crowd like wildfire, though this time the whispers were not filled with pity or mockery. They were filled with astonishment. Elena stood at the top of the staircase for only a moment, her gaze sweeping calmly across the crowded hall. She had not expected to find herself walking into such a grand event. She had come only to find her grandmother, following the directions given by the letter, believing this address to be simply a residence where the Dowager Countess was staying for the season. She had no idea the greatest ball of the year was taking place within these very walls, and she certainly had no idea her husband was standing only a short distance away, his face pale with shock, a woman she did not recognize standing far too close beside him. Elena's eyes found Julian across the room, and for the briefest moment, something flickered across her expression, though she did not allow it to linger. She had always carried herself with dignity, even in moments of difficulty, and tonight would be no exception. She lifted her chin slightly and began descending the staircase, her steps measured and graceful, as though she had walked into rooms like this 1,000 times before. Julian felt his stomach twist into a painful knot. He set down his glass, uncertain of what to do, uncertain of how to explain the woman standing beside him, uncertain of how he would ever begin to make sense of the disaster now unfolding in front of hundreds of witnesses. Camille, sensing the sudden tension, glanced between Julian and the approaching Duchess, a slow understanding beginning to dawn across her features. The whispers around the room grew louder. guests leaning toward one another, exchanging shocked glances, some even beginning to smile, with the particular delight that comes from witnessing a scandal unfold in real time. This was the woman they had heard so little about, the mysterious wife of the Duke, finally appearing before them all, and the timing could not have been worse for Julian. As Elena reached the bottom of the staircase, the crowd parted slightly to allow her passage, though every eye remained fixed upon her. She walked forward with quiet confidence, her simple gown somehow more striking than the elaborate dresses worn by the other guests, her calm demeanor drawing attention in a way that loud laughter and expensive jewelry never could. She did not immediately approach Julian. Instead, she scanned the room, searching for the familiar face of her grandmother, still unaware of the full scope of what was happening around her. It was only when Lady Winslow, unable to contain her curiosity any longer, approached Elena directly, that the true nature of the evening began to reveal itself. "Your Grace," Lady Winslow said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "we were told you were too unwell to attend tonight. How wonderful that you have recovered so quickly." Elena turned toward the woman, her expression remaining calm, despite the confusion beginning to settle in her mind. "I apologize," Elena said politely, "but I believe there has been some misunderstanding. I was not aware of any event taking place this evening. I have come only to find my grandmother, the Dowager Countess Beaumont." Lady Winslow's eyebrows rose slightly, and she glanced toward Julian, who stood frozen near the refreshment table, unable to find the words to explain himself. The realization of what had happened settled over Elena slowly, like a cold chill spreading through the room. Her husband had told his guests she was too sick to attend, when in truth, she had never even been informed of the invitation at all. Elena's expression did not shift into anger or embarrassment, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily upon her. She had always known Julian carried a certain shame about their marriage, a discomfort with her quiet manner and modest background, but she had never imagined he would go so far as to hide her existence entirely from an event of this magnitude. She lifted her gaze and found Julian's eyes across the room. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the noise of the crowd fading into the background as husband and wife stared at one another. The truth of the evening laid bare between them, without a single word needing to be said. Julian took a hesitant step forward, opening his mouth to offer some kind of explanation, though he had no idea what words could possibly make sense of the situation he now found himself in. Before he could speak, however, another voice rang out from the top of the staircase, commanding and familiar, silencing the murmurs of the crowd almost instantly. "Elena, my dear, there you are." The Dowager Countess Margaret Beaumont stood at the top of the stairs, leaning slightly on an ornate cane, her sharp eyes surveying the room with the kind of authority that came from decades of navigating high society without ever losing her composure. She descended the staircase slowly, her presence commanding immediate respect from every guest in attendance, and as she reached the bottom, she moved directly toward Elena, taking her granddaughter's hands warmly in her own. "I did not expect you to arrive tonight of all nights," Margaret said, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear, "though I suppose fate has a way of arranging things exactly as they need to happen." Elena studied her grandmother's face carefully, searching for signs of illness, though the Countess appeared far more energetic than her letter had suggested. A flicker of understanding passed between them, though Elena said nothing, choosing instead to remain composed in front of the watching crowd. Julian, meanwhile, felt the eyes of the entire room settling upon him, judgment and curiosity mixing together, in a way that made his skin prickle with discomfort. Camille had quietly stepped back from his side, sensing that whatever was unfolding was far beyond anything she wished to be associated with. She offered a polite excuse about needing fresh air and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Julian standing alone, exposed, with nowhere left to hide from the consequences of his own choices. The musicians, sensing the shift in atmosphere, attempted to resume their playing, though the melody felt hollow against the tension still hanging thick in the air. Guests continued to whisper among themselves, some sympathetic toward Elena, others simply delighted by the unfolding drama, eager to share the story with anyone who had not witnessed it firsthand. Elena turned once more toward Julian, her expression calm but unreadable. She did not approach him, nor did she demand an explanation in front of the crowd. Instead, she simply nodded politely, the kind of gesture one might offer a stranger rather than a husband, and turned back to her grandmother, allowing herself to be led gently away from the center of attention. Julian remained standing near the refreshment table, his heart pounding, his mind racing through every possible explanation he might offer, though he understood with a sinking certainty that no explanation would undo what had just happened. The entire hall had witnessed his shame, had witnessed the moment his careful deception crumbled apart in an instant, and he knew, even as the music resumed and conversations slowly returned to normal, that tonight marked the beginning of something he could not control. As Elena walked away with her grandmother, her back straight and her steps steady, she carried with her a quiet resolve that even she did not yet fully understand. She had come to this city searching for answers about her ailing grandmother, only to discover a truth about her marriage that would change everything moving forward. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing, with absolute certainty: she would not allow herself to be treated as something to be hidden away, ashamed and unseen, ever again. Behind her, Julian watched his wife disappear into the crowd, the woman he had tried so hard to keep separate from his public life, now standing at the very center of the season's greatest scandal. And somewhere deep within him, beneath the panic and the humiliation, a small and uncomfortable realization began to take root. He had made a terrible mistake, and the cost of that mistake was only just beginning to reveal itself. The night stretched on, the ball continuing around them, but for Julian, everything had already changed. The whispers would not stop tonight. They would follow him for weeks, perhaps months, spreading through every drawing room and every dinner party across the city. And somewhere in that spreading story, the truth about his marriage, and the woman he had tried so hard to erase from his public life, would finally come to light. The morning after the ball, the city buzzed with a single topic of conversation. In every drawing room, every breakfast table, every carriage rolling through the busy streets, the same story passed from lips to ears with growing excitement. The Duke of Ashcombe had brought another woman to the grandest event of the season, only for his real wife to appear unannounced, revealing his deception in front of everyone who mattered. Julian woke late that morning in his city townhouse, his head heavy from the wine he had consumed the night before, in an attempt to numb the humiliation still burning through him. He lay in bed for several minutes, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous evening over and over, searching for some way the situation could have gone differently. No matter how he examined it, the outcome remained the same. He had been caught, publicly and completely, and there was no undoing what had happened. His valet entered quietly, carrying a tray with tea and a stack of correspondence that had arrived since dawn. Julian sat up slowly, rubbing his temples, and reached for the letters without much enthusiasm. Most were the usual invitations and requests that came with his title, but one letter near the bottom of the stack caught his attention immediately. It bore the seal of his own family, sent by his younger sister, Charlotte, who lived at their family's countryside estate. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter, and even before he finished reading the first line, he could sense the disapproval woven through every carefully chosen word. "Julian," the letter began, "news of last night's events has already reached us here, faster than I would have thought possible. I can hardly believe what I have heard. Tell me it is not true that you brought another woman to the ball, while your own wife remained uninformed and left behind. I have always tried to support you, but this is beyond anything I imagined you capable of doing." Julian set the letter down, his jaw tightening. Even his own sister, far removed from the city and its endless gossip, had already learned of his disgrace. If word had traveled that quickly to the countryside, there was no telling how far the story might spread by the end of the week. He dressed slowly, his mind still clouded with the events of the previous night, and made his way downstairs to the study, where he hoped a moment of quiet might help clear his thoughts. Instead, he found his butler waiting with an anxious expression, holding yet another stack of correspondence that had arrived within the hour. "Several messages have come this morning, Your Grace," the butler said carefully, "some from business associates. One from Lord Pemberton, requesting to postpone the meeting scheduled for next week." Julian frowned. Lord Pemberton had been eager to finalize an important business arrangement with him for months, an agreement that would have secured significant investment for one of Julian's estates. A sudden postponement, especially following the events of last night, did not bode well. "Did he give a reason?" Julian asked. "Only that his schedule had become unexpectedly full, Your Grace." Julian said nothing, though the implication was clear enough. Word of his humiliation was already affecting matters far beyond simple gossip. His reputation, once a source of pride and influence, had become something people wished to distance themselves from overnight. Meanwhile, across the city, Elena sat in the elegant drawing room of her grandmother's townhouse, a cup of tea untouched on the table beside her. Margaret Beaumont sat across from her, watching her granddaughter carefully, noting the quiet composure Elena maintained, despite the emotional weight of the previous evening. "You have not asked me anything about last night," Margaret said gently, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Elena looked up, her expression calm but tired. "I am not certain what there is to ask, grandmother. I saw everything I needed to see with my own eyes." Margaret set down her own cup and folded her hands in her lap. "I must confess something to you, my dear. I am not as unwell as my letter suggested. I wrote to you because I had grown concerned about your situation, concerned about the silence surrounding your marriage. I had hoped to speak with you privately about it, though I never imagined we would both stumble into such a public revelation on the very night I planned to raise the subject." Elena's eyes widened slightly with surprise, though she quickly composed herself. "You knew something was wrong?" "I suspected," Margaret admitted. "Word travels, even to old women who rarely leave their homes anymore. I heard whispers that the Duke attended events alone, that no one in the city had ever laid eyes on his wife, that some had even begun to wonder if you existed at all. I wished to understand the truth before deciding how best to help you." Elena lowered her gaze, staring into the cooling tea before her. "He never told me about the ball, grandmother. He never even mentioned an invitation. I only learned of it by walking directly into it, entirely by accident, believing I had simply arrived at your residence for the evening." Margaret reached forward and took her granddaughter's hand gently. "I am sorry you had to learn the truth in such a painful way, in front of so many watching eyes. But perhaps, in some strange manner, it is better this way. Better that the truth revealed itself clearly, rather than continuing to hide in shadows and half-truths." Elena remained quiet for a long moment, considering her grandmother's words. She thought back to the early months of her marriage, to the quiet distance Julian had always maintained, to the way he rarely spoke of his life in the city, to the small excuses he offered whenever she asked about attending events together. She had told herself it was simply his nature, a reserved and private man, uncomfortable with public displays. She had never imagined the full extent of what he had been hiding. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked softly. Elena lifted her chin slightly, a flicker of quiet resolve passing across her features. "I do not yet know, but I know I will not return to pretending nothing has happened. I will not go back to being hidden away, as though I am something to be ashamed of." Margaret smiled faintly, pride evident in her expression. "Good. You have always carried more strength than you realize, my dear. It is time others began to see it as well." As the two women continued their quiet conversation, news of the previous night's events continued spreading through the city with remarkable speed. In the marketplace, merchants discussed the scandal between transactions. In private clubs, gentlemen speculated about the true nature of the Duke's marriage. In fashionable tea rooms, ladies exchanged theories about who Elena truly was and why her husband had gone to such lengths to keep her hidden. By afternoon, a new piece of information began circulating, one that added an entirely different dimension to the unfolding scandal. Someone, perhaps a guest, who had overheard Margaret's earlier conversation with Elena, or perhaps simply through careful research prompted by curiosity, discovered the truth about Elena's family history. She was not simply a quiet woman of modest background, as many had assumed. She was the granddaughter of Margaret Beaumont, one of the most respected and influential figures in the kingdom's history, a woman whose family had once held considerable power and wealth, long before financial misfortune had quietly reduced their public presence in recent years. More surprising still, it was revealed that Elena stood to inherit a significant portion of her family's remaining estate and fortune, a fact that had been kept quiet due to ongoing legal matters following her parents' passing years earlier. The modest life she had lived before her marriage to Julian had not reflected poverty, but rather careful discretion, while matters of inheritance were settled through proper legal channels. This revelation spread through the city even faster than the initial scandal itself. The woman Julian had been too embarrassed to bring to a ball, the woman he had hidden away and lied about, was quietly poised to become one of the wealthiest and most influential women in the kingdom. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone who heard it, and soon the story shifted from simple gossip about infidelity to something far more compelling: a tale of a foolish duke who had underestimated his own wife in every possible way. Julian, unaware of this new development, spent his day attempting to salvage what remained of his reputation. He wrote letters of explanation to several key associates, though each attempt at justification sounded weaker than the last, even to his own ears. He considered visiting Elena directly, hoping a private conversation might smooth over the damage, though he hesitated, uncertain of what to say, or how she might respond after witnessing his betrayal so publicly. By evening, he finally gathered enough courage to send a message to his wife, requesting a private meeting at her grandmother's residence. He waited anxiously for a response, pacing the length of his study as the hours passed slowly. When the reply finally arrived, it was brief and formal, containing none of the warmth that had once characterized their correspondence, however limited it had been. "Your Grace may call tomorrow afternoon," the message read simply, signed only with Elena's initials, offering no further indication of her thoughts or feelings. Julian stared at the note for a long time, an uncomfortable weight settling in his chest. The formality of her words felt like a wall being built between them, brick by careful brick, and he understood, perhaps for the first time, that repairing the damage he had caused would not be a simple matter of apology and explanation. That night, as Julian prepared for the difficult conversation ahead, word of Elena's true inheritance finally reached his ears through a hurried conversation with one of his business associates. He listened in stunned silence as the details were laid out before him: the significant wealth, the respected family name, the influence that came with being connected to the Beaumont lineage. He sat alone in his study long after his associate had departed, staring into the flickering light of a single candle, grappling with the reality that he had spent months treating as an embarrassment the very woman who could have elevated his own standing far beyond anything he currently possessed. His pride had blinded him to the truth of who Elena truly was, and now that truth had been revealed to the entire city in the most public manner imaginable, leaving him to face the consequences of his own foolishness. The following morning arrived with a cold, gray sky, matching the heavy mood that had settled over Julian since the previous night's revelations. He dressed carefully, choosing his words just as deliberately, rehearsing what he might say to Elena when he arrived for their scheduled meeting. He had never felt so uncertain walking into any conversation before, not even during the most difficult business negotiations of his career. As his carriage made its way through the city streets toward the Beaumont residence, Julian noticed the curious glances of passers-by, people who recognized his family crest on the carriage and whispered amongst themselves as it passed. The scandal had clearly spread far beyond the walls of the ballroom, reaching every corner of the city with astonishing speed. When he arrived at the townhouse, he was greeted at the door by a servant who led him quietly into the same drawing room where Elena and her grandmother had spoken the day before. Elena sat near the window, her posture composed, her expression giving away little of what she truly felt as her husband entered the room. "Elena," Julian began, his voice unsteady in a way that surprised even himself, "I have come to apologize, and to explain, if you will allow me." Elena studied him for a long moment before responding, her eyes carrying a quiet weight that made Julian shift uncomfortably where he stood. "I am listening," she said simply, offering no further encouragement, no warmth to soften the difficult conversation that lay ahead. Julian took a slow breath, understanding that whatever he said next would shape the course of everything that followed between them, and that no amount of careful wording could undo the pain his choices had already caused. Julian remained standing in the middle of the drawing room, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, searching for the right words to begin an apology he had rehearsed a dozen times in the carriage, yet still could not properly deliver. Elena watched him from her seat near the window, her expression calm, though her patience was clearly wearing thin with every passing second of silence. "I never meant for things to unfold the way they did," Julian finally said, his voice quieter than he intended. "I made a foolish decision, and I understand now how deeply it has hurt you." "You did not simply make a foolish decision, Julian," Elena replied evenly. "You made a choice to hide me from your world entirely. You told an entire ballroom that I was too unwell to attend, when in truth, you never even informed me such an event was taking place. That is not foolishness. That is deliberate deception." Julian opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, unable to find any words that might soften the truth of her statement. Everything she said was accurate, and he knew that offering excuses would only deepen the wound, rather than heal it. "You are right," he admitted quietly. I was ashamed, though I understand now how wrong that shame was. I worried what others would think of our marriage, worried that you would not fit into the world I move within, and rather than facing that fear honestly, I chose to hide you away instead. Elena's eyes narrowed slightly, though her voice remained controlled. And did it ever occur to you to simply ask me, to speak with me honestly about your concerns, rather than making decisions about my life without my knowledge? Julian lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes any longer. No, it did not, and I regret that more than I can properly express. The room fell into silence once more, the weight of unspoken emotions pressing heavily between them. Elena rose slowly from her seat, walking toward the window, her back turned to Julian, as she gathered her thoughts before speaking again. Do you know what it felt like, she began softly, to walk into that ballroom, expecting only to find my grandmother, and instead discovering that my own husband had chosen another woman to stand beside him at the most important event of the season? Do you understand what it felt like to see every guest in that room already aware of a lie about my health, a lie you had constructed without my knowledge? Julian remained silent, understanding that this was not a moment for him to speak, but rather a moment for him to listen. I have spent months in that countryside estate, Elena continued, believing our quiet life together was simply a reflection of your private nature, your preference for solitude over the noise of society. I told myself you were simply a reserved man, uncomfortable with large gatherings. I never once considered that you were ashamed of me, that you viewed me as something to be hidden away, rather than someone to stand proudly beside. Elena, that was never. Please, she interrupted, turning back to face him, her eyes carrying a quiet intensity that silenced him immediately. Allow me to finish. Julian nodded, pressing his lips together tightly. I do not know what kind of marriage you believed we were building, Elena continued, but I know now that it was not built on honesty. And a marriage without honesty is not truly a marriage at all. It is simply two people sharing a title and a household, nothing more. Julian felt the truth of her words settle heavily upon him, each sentence striking deeper than the last. He had known, even before arriving at this meeting, that his apologies would sound hollow against the weight of his actions, but hearing Elena articulate the depth of his betrayal made the reality far more painful than he had anticipated. What can I do, he asked quietly, to begin repairing what I have broken? Elena studied him carefully before answering, her expression softening only slightly. I do not know if it can be repaired, Julian. Trust, once broken so completely, does not simply return because an apology has been offered. It must be rebuilt slowly, through actions rather than words, and I am not certain you understand the difference between the two. Julian nodded slowly, accepting the weight of her statement without argument. Then tell me what actions you would have me take. I am willing to do whatever is necessary to prove that I understand the depth of my mistake. Elena crossed her arms gently, considering his words for a long moment before responding. For now, I intend to remain here with my grandmother. I need time to think clearly, away from the household we have shared, away from the pressures of your position and your reputation. I will not return to the estate until I am certain of what I truly want moving forward. The words struck Julian harder than he expected, though he understood he had no right to argue against her decision. And what of appearances? He asked cautiously. People will notice if you remain separated from me for an extended period. The gossip surrounding us has already spread throughout the city. Elena's expression hardened slightly. Perhaps you should have considered the matter of appearances before choosing to hide me from your world in the first place, Julian. I will not rush my own healing, simply to manage the opinions of people who whispered cruelly about me before ever meeting me at all. Julian lowered his head, accepting the rebuke without further protest. He understood, with growing clarity, that his previous concerns about reputation and appearances had led directly to the disaster now unfolding around him, and that continuing to prioritize such concerns would only worsen an already difficult situation. I understand, he said quietly. I will respect whatever time you need. Elena studied him a moment longer, searching his expression for any sign of insincerity, though she found none. Whatever else Julian's faults may have been, she did not believe he was lying to her in this moment. There is something else you should know, she said after a pause, her tone shifting slightly. My grandmother informed me yesterday of certain matters concerning my family's inheritance. matters I myself was not fully aware of until recently. Julian's brow furrowed with curiosity, though he remained quiet, allowing her to continue. It appears, Elena said carefully, that I am set to inherit a significant portion of my family's estate, along with considerable wealth that has been carefully managed since my parents' passing. My grandmother believed it wise to keep this information quiet until legal matters were fully settled, though it seems word has already begun spreading through the city regardless. Julian's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession, surprise giving way to something closer to shame, as he considered the implications of her words. The woman he had hidden away out of embarrassment, the wife he had considered unworthy of public appearances, was in truth connected to one of the most respected and wealthy families in the kingdom, a fact he had never bothered to properly investigate before their marriage had even taken place. I did not know, he said quietly, his voice carrying genuine surprise. No, Elena replied evenly, you did not. Because you never took the time to truly know me at all, Julian. You married me for reasons of your own, and you built assumptions about who I was, without ever asking the questions that might have revealed the truth. The silence that followed felt heavier than any that had come before it. Julian understood, with painful clarity, that his own pride and carelessness had blinded him not only to his wife's true character, but to the very real advantages her family connections might have offered him, advantages he had unknowingly discarded through his own foolish behavior. I should go, he said finally, recognizing that continuing the conversation further would accomplish little beyond deepening the tension already present between them. I will respect your wishes and allow you the time you need. Elena nodded once, offering no further words, as Julian turned and made his way toward the door. Before he could exit the room entirely, however, she spoke once more, her voice carrying a quiet firmness that stopped him in his tracks. Julian. He turned back toward her, waiting. If you truly wish to earn back any measure of trust between us, you will need to demonstrate through your actions that you understand what you have done, not simply through words spoken in a single conversation. Actions take time, and patience, and genuine reflection. I will be watching to see whether you possess any of those qualities. Julian held her gaze for a long moment, nodding slowly. I understand, he said quietly, before finally exiting the drawing room and making his way back toward his waiting carriage. As he settled into his seat and the carriage began its journey back through the city streets, Julian found himself replaying every word of the conversation, each statement Elena had made settling more heavily upon him with every passing minute. He had entered the meeting believing a sincere apology might be enough to begin repairing the damage he had caused. He left understanding that the road ahead would require far more than simple words, that rebuilding any trust with Elena would demand patience, humility, and genuine change, qualities he was not entirely certain he possessed. Meanwhile, inside the townhouse, Elena remained standing near the window, long after Julian's carriage had disappeared from view. Margaret entered the room quietly, having waited nearby during the difficult conversation, and studied her granddaughter's expression with careful attention. How do you feel? Margaret asked gently. Elena exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders, now that the conversation had concluded. I feel as though I have said everything I needed to say, grandmother. Whether he truly understands the weight of it remains to be seen. Margaret moved to stand beside her, resting a comforting hand on Elena's shoulder. You handled yourself with tremendous grace, my dear. Whatever happens next, know that you have already proven something important, both to Julian and to yourself. You are not a woman who can be easily hidden away or dismissed. Elena allowed herself a small, tired smile, though the weight of the previous days still pressed heavily upon her thoughts. She knew the road ahead remained uncertain, that whatever decisions she made in the coming weeks would shape not only her own future, but the future of a marriage that had been built upon far shakier foundations than she had ever realized. Yet for the first time since walking into that ballroom, she felt a quiet sense of clarity settling within her, a recognition that whatever happened next, she would face it with the same strength and dignity that had carried her through every difficult moment of her life thus far. 2 weeks passed since Julian's difficult visit to the Beaumont residence, and in that time, the city had not grown quiet about the scandal that continued to unfold. If anything, the story had only grown larger, twisting and expanding with each retelling, until it had become one of the most talked about events of the entire season. Camille found herself at the center of a different kind of difficulty during those weeks. Once celebrated for her charm and her ability to navigate the highest circles of society with ease, she now found doors closing that had once opened readily before her. Hostesses who had eagerly sought her presence at their gatherings now offered polite excuses when sending invitations elsewhere. The very people who had once admired her boldness in accompanying a duke to the season's greatest event now viewed her as complicit in a scandal that had humiliated a woman many had come to respect, even before meeting her. She sat in her modest sitting room one afternoon, reading through a stack of correspondence that contained far fewer invitations than she had grown accustomed to receiving. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and her maid entered, informing her that a visitor had arrived. "Lady Winslow, my lady," the maid announced, stepping aside to allow the woman entry. Camille rose to greet her guest, though something in Lady Winslow's expression suggested this was not a purely social call. "Lady Winslow, what a pleasant surprise. Please, sit." Lady Winslow settled into a chair across from Camille, her expression carrying the particular sharpness of someone eager to discuss matters others might consider improper. "I thought you should know," she began without preamble, "that the story has taken on new dimensions since the ball. Have you heard about the Duchess's family connections?" Camille's brow furrowed slightly. "I have heard whispers, though nothing confirmed." "It is confirmed," Lady Winslow said, leaning forward with evident enthusiasm. "The Duchess is granddaughter to Margaret Beaumont, and it seems she stands to inherit a considerable fortune, along with a family name that carries far more weight than anyone previously realized. The Duke, it appears, has made a terrible mistake in how he treated her." Camille absorbed this information slowly, understanding immediately the implications for her own position within the unfolding scandal. If Elena's standing continued to rise, while Julian's continued to fall, Camille's association with the Duke would only become more damaging to her own reputation as time passed. "This changes things considerably," Camille murmured, more to herself than to her guest. "Indeed it does," Lady Winslow agreed, a knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Many are already saying the Duke has made the greatest error of his life, casting aside a woman of such standing in favor of appearances and pride. It would be wise, my dear, to consider how closely you wish to remain associated with him moving forward." After Lady Winslow departed, Camille sat alone for a long while, considering her options carefully. She had entered the arrangement with Julian, believing it might elevate her own social standing, offering opportunities that might otherwise remain closed to a woman of her more modest background. Instead, the arrangement had placed her directly in the center of a scandal that threatened to damage her reputation beyond repair. She made her decision that evening, penning a careful letter to Julian, explaining that she believed it best for both their sakes if they were no longer seen together in public, at least until the current scandal had quieted sufficiently. She dressed her words carefully, avoiding any language that might suggest blame, though the underlying message remained clear enough. She was distancing herself from him entirely, unwilling to allow his crumbling reputation to drag her further into disgrace alongside him. Julian received the letter the following morning, reading it slowly in his study, a bitter understanding settling over him as he processed its contents. Even Camille, the woman he had chosen specifically because he believed she would elevate his appearance in society, now wished to separate herself from him as quickly as possible. He was, it seemed, becoming a man that others actively avoided, a stark contrast to the influential position he had occupied only weeks before. He set the letter down and rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of isolation pressing upon him more heavily with each passing day. His business associates had grown distant, several important negotiations had stalled entirely, and now even his brief companion in scandal wished nothing further to do with him. The consequences of his choices seemed to multiply endlessly, each new development revealing another layer of damage he had inflicted upon his own life through a single night of foolish pride. Later that same day, Julian received a visit from his younger sister, Charlotte, who had traveled from the countryside estate, specifically to speak with him after learning of the unfolding events. She entered his study with an expression that carried both concern and quiet disappointment, settling into a chair across from him without waiting for a formal invitation. "I have heard everything," Charlotte began, her voice carrying none of the warmth their previous conversations typically held. "The whole city speaks of little else, and I confess I struggle to understand how my own brother could treat his wife with such carelessness." Julian sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. I have already heard every criticism imaginable, Charlotte. I do not require another from you. Perhaps you require exactly that, Charlotte replied firmly, because it seems clear you have not yet fully grasped the severity of what you have done. Elena is not simply some quiet woman you can hide away out of embarrassment. She deserves better than that, and frankly, so does our family name, which now carries the weight of your foolishness alongside it. Julian's jaw tightened, though he said nothing in his own defense, understanding that his sister's harsh words carried a truth he could not easily dismiss. I have spoken with several of our relatives, Charlotte continued, her tone softening only slightly. They are deeply concerned about the impact this scandal may have on our family's standing. Cousin Nathaniel has already mentioned reconsidering certain business arrangements that involve our family name, out of concern for how closely it is now associated with dishonesty and public embarrassment. Julian felt his stomach tighten further at this news. Nathaniel's business connections had long been valuable to the wider Ashcombe family, and losing that support would create difficulties reaching far beyond his own personal reputation. What would you have me do, Charlotte? He asked, his voice carrying genuine frustration mixed with growing desperation. I have already apologized to Elena directly. I have given her the time and space she requested. An apology is simply words, Julian, Charlotte replied. What matters now is what you do moving forward. Have you made any genuine effort to understand Elena, to learn who she truly is, beyond the assumptions you built about her before your marriage even began? Julian remained silent, unable to answer honestly, for he realized he had spent remarkably little time truly getting to know his own wife during the months of their marriage. He had married her under circumstances arranged largely by family connections and practical considerations, and he had allowed his own preconceptions about her quiet nature to shape his behavior toward her ever since, without ever bothering to challenge those assumptions through genuine conversation or effort. I do not know her as well as I should, he admitted quietly. Charlotte's expression softened slightly at his honesty, though her concern remained evident. Then perhaps that is where you must begin, Julian. Not with grand gestures or public displays meant to repair your reputation, but with genuine effort to understand the woman you married. If you continue focusing only on how this scandal affects your own standing, you will never truly repair what has been broken. Julian considered his sister's words carefully, recognizing the wisdom within them, even as pride urged him to resist such difficult self-reflection. He had spent his entire adult life prioritizing appearances and reputation above all else, and the idea of setting aside those priorities in favor of genuine humility felt foreign and uncomfortable. I will consider what you have said, he told her finally. Charlotte studied him for a long moment before rising from her chair. I hope you do more than simply consider it, brother, because if you do not change your approach, I fear you will lose Elena entirely, along with whatever remains of your reputation in this city. After Charlotte departed, Julian remained alone in his study for the remainder of the afternoon, staring at the fading light streaming through the windows as the day drew toward evening. He thought back over the months of his marriage, searching his memory for moments where he might have made genuine efforts to know Elena beyond superficial pleasantries, and found remarkably few examples to draw upon. He remembered brief conversations over dinner, questions asked more out of obligation than genuine curiosity, quiet evenings spent in separate rooms rather than together, each of them occupied with their own pursuits rather than seeking one another's company. He had allowed distance to grow between them from the very beginning of their marriage, and that distance had made it far too easy to justify the decision to leave her behind when the ball's invitation arrived. As evening settled fully over the city, Julian made a decision that surprised even himself. Rather than continuing to focus on damage control among his business associates and social connections, he would instead dedicate himself to understanding Elena properly, to learning who she truly was, beyond the assumptions he had carelessly built during their brief courtship and subsequent marriage. He began by reviewing what little he actually knew about her background, recalling fragments of conversations from years before regarding her family history, though he realized now how incomplete his understanding truly was. He resolved to speak with those who knew her well, to ask genuine questions, rather than simply accepting surface-level explanations, and to approach any future conversation with Elena herself with far greater humility than he had previously shown. It was a small step, perhaps insufficient given the depth of damage his previous choices had caused, but it represented the beginning of genuine reflection, rather than simple damage control, focused solely on restoring his own reputation. Whether this change would prove sufficient to repair his marriage remained uncertain, but for the first time since the disastrous night of the ball, Julian found himself considering not what he stood to lose in the eyes of society, but what he had genuinely failed to understand about the woman who shared his name and his life. A month had passed since the night of the ball, and the city's fascination with the scandal showed little sign of fading. If anything, new details continued to emerge, each one adding fresh fuel to conversations held in drawing rooms and private clubs across the capital. Elena remained at her grandmother's townhouse throughout this period, gradually settling into a quiet routine that allowed her the space to consider her future without the pressure of Julian's presence constantly weighing upon her thoughts. During this time, Elena began accompanying her grandmother to smaller social gatherings, carefully chosen events where Margaret's influence ensured a respectful reception rather than the harsh judgment Elena might have otherwise faced. She discovered, much to her surprise, that many of the women she encountered at these gatherings held genuine sympathy for her situation, rather than the mockery she had feared might follow her wherever she went. At one such gathering, a small afternoon tea, hosted by a longtime friend of her grandmother's, Elena found herself in conversation with a woman named Beatrice Hartley, whose warm manner immediately put her at ease. "I must say," Beatrice remarked over her teacup, "I admire your composure through all of this. Many women in your position would have made quite a scene, and rightfully so, given how you were treated. Yet you have carried yourself with such dignity throughout." Elena offered a small smile, appreciating the kind words. "I confess, there were moments I wished to do exactly that, to make a scene and let everyone know precisely what I thought of the situation. But I have always believed dignity serves a person better than anger, even when anger feels justified." "A wise philosophy," Beatrice agreed, though I imagine a difficult one to maintain under such circumstances. Their conversation continued for some time, touching on various topics beyond the scandal itself, and Elena found herself genuinely enjoying the company of women who seemed to value her for who she was, rather than simply as a subject of gossip. It was a refreshing change from the isolation she had experienced during her earlier months of marriage, when Julian's reluctance to include her in his social circle had left her feeling perpetually on the outside of conversations and relationships that might have otherwise brought her comfort and connection. As the tea gathering drew to a close, Margaret approached her granddaughter with a thoughtful expression. "You seem to be finding your footing here in the city, Elena. I am pleased to see it." "I did not expect to enjoy myself as much as I have," Elena admitted. "I had always assumed city society would be exactly as unwelcoming as Julian seemed to believe it would be toward me." Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. "Julian's assumptions about society, my dear, often say more about his own insecurities than about the reality of how others might have received you. He judged you unfairly, and in doing so, denied you the opportunity to discover connections and friendships that clearly bring you genuine joy." Elena considered her grandmother's words as they made their way home in the carriage, reflecting on how much of her earlier isolation had stemmed not from any genuine unsuitability on her part, but from Julian's own fears and misconceptions about how she might be received. It was a realization that brought both sadness and a quiet strength, understanding that the limitations placed upon her marriage had been largely of Julian's own making, rather than any true reflection of her worth or capabilities. Meanwhile, across the city, Julian had begun the difficult process of genuine self-reflection that his sister had urged him toward. He spent considerable time speaking with those who had known Elena before their marriage, gathering fragments of information about her character and history that he had never bothered to learn during their courtship. He learned, through careful inquiry, that Elena had spent much of her youth caring for her ailing mother before her passing, demonstrating a patience and strength that had gone largely unrecognized by those around her. He learned that she had maintained close friendships with several women from her childhood, relationships built on genuine loyalty rather than social convenience. He learned, perhaps most surprisingly, that she possessed a sharp intelligence and quiet wit that she rarely displayed publicly, choosing instead to observe and listen rather than draw attention to herself. Each new piece of information deepened Julian's understanding of the woman he had married, and with that understanding came growing regret for how thoroughly he had failed to appreciate her during the months of their marriage. He began to recognize patterns in his own behavior. Moments where he had dismissed her thoughtful observations as simple quietness, where he had mistaken her reserved nature for a lack of substance, when in truth, she had simply been navigating a marriage that offered her little genuine opportunity for connection or expression. One evening, Julian found himself reviewing old correspondence between himself and Elena from the early months of their marriage, letters exchanged during a brief period when he had traveled for business while she remained at their estate. Reading through her words with fresh eyes, he noticed details he had previously overlooked, thoughtful observations about estate management, gentle suggestions regarding household matters that demonstrated far more capability and insight than he had ever acknowledged at the time. He set the letters aside, feeling a growing weight of regret settling over him. He had married a woman of genuine substance and intelligence, and rather than nurturing that connection, he had allowed his own insecurities and pride to create distance between them, from nearly the very beginning of their union. Determined to make genuine progress, Julian decided the time had come to request another meeting with Elena, though this time he intended to approach the conversation differently, focusing not on apologies for his past behavior, but on genuine questions about who she was and what she truly desired from her life and their marriage moving forward. He sent a carefully worded letter requesting the meeting, taking care to specify that he wished simply to speak with her, without any expectation of immediate reconciliation or forgiveness. He understood, based on his sister's guidance and his own growing self-awareness, that rebuilding trust would require patience rather than pressure, genuine effort rather than hollow gestures meant to satisfy his own need for resolution. Elena received the letter several days later, reading it carefully in the quiet of her grandmother's drawing room. Unlike his previous correspondence, this letter carried a different tone, less focused on his own guilt and more focused on genuine curiosity about her thoughts and feelings. She considered the letter for some time before responding, uncertain whether this shift in approach represented genuine change or simply a new tactic in his attempts to repair the damage he had caused. She discussed the matter with her grandmother that evening, seeking counsel on how best to proceed. "What does your instinct tell you?" Margaret asked, watching her granddaughter carefully as she considered the question. "I do not know," Elena admitted. "Part of me wishes to refuse, to protect myself from further disappointment, should this simply be another empty gesture. Yet another part of me recognizes that if I never allow him the opportunity to demonstrate genuine change, I will never truly know whether such change is possible." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "There is wisdom in caution, my dear. But there is also wisdom in allowing space for growth, provided you protect your own boundaries carefully as you do so. You need not forgive him immediately, nor accept whatever he offers without question. But perhaps a conversation, approached with your guard appropriately raised, might help clarify matters moving forward." Elena considered her grandmother's counsel carefully, weighing the risks of further disappointment against the possibility of genuine progress. After several days of careful thought, she finally responded to Julian's letter, agreeing to a meeting, though she specified clearly that she expected honesty and patience rather than pressure or expectation. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, and as the day approached, both Julian and Elena found themselves preparing carefully for what they each understood might represent a turning point in determining the future of their marriage. For Julian, it represented an opportunity to demonstrate the genuine change he had been working toward since his sister's difficult but necessary intervention. For Elena, it represented a cautious step toward understanding whether the man she had married was capable of the growth and humility necessary to rebuild what his earlier choices had so thoroughly damaged. Neither of them could predict with certainty how the conversation would unfold, but both approached the coming meeting with a shared, if unspoken, hope that perhaps something genuine and lasting might yet be salvaged from the wreckage of pride and misunderstanding that had brought them to this difficult point in their shared history. The day of the second meeting arrived under clear skies, a welcome change from the gray weather that had lingered over the city in recent weeks. Julian arrived at the Beaumont residence earlier than the appointed time, choosing to walk the final distance rather than arrive by carriage, hoping the quiet exercise might help settle the nervous energy building within him. He was shown into the same drawing room as before, though this time Elena was already seated, a book resting closed in her lap as she waited for him to arrive. She looked up as he entered, her expression carrying none of the sharp coldness from their previous conversation, though neither did it carry any particular warmth. It was simply neutral, watchful. waiting to see what this meeting might reveal. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Julian said, taking a seat across from her, rather than remaining standing, as he had during their previous conversation. "You said in your letter that you wished simply to talk," Elena replied. "I am curious what that means, given our last conversation ended with apologies and explanations that changed little in practical terms." Julian nodded, understanding her skepticism was entirely justified. "I do not wish to apologize again today, Elena. I have already said those words, and I understand that repeating them serves little purpose without action to support them. Instead, I wish to ask you some questions, if you are willing to answer them." Elena's brow lifted slightly with curiosity, though she remained cautious. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about you," Julian said simply. "About who you are, what you value, what you hoped for when we first married. I realize now that I never properly asked these things during our courtship, or in the months since our wedding. I built assumptions about you instead, and those assumptions led directly to the choices that caused you so much pain." Elena studied him carefully, searching his expression for any sign of insincerity, though she found none evident in his careful words. "That is an unusual approach," she said finally. "Most men in your position would focus on convincing me of their remorse, rather than genuinely seeking to understand me." "Perhaps that is precisely the mistake I have been making," Julian replied. "Focusing on my own guilt, rather than genuinely trying to know you as a person." A long silence stretched between them, before Elena finally spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "When I was younger, I cared for my mother during her final years of illness. It taught me patience, and it taught me the value of quiet strength over loud displays of emotion. I learned to observe carefully, to understand people through their actions rather than simply their words, because I watched my mother's condition change in small, subtle ways that others often failed to notice." Julian listened attentively, recognizing this as a rare glimpse into a part of Elena's life he had never bothered to ask about before. "When we married," Elena continued, "I hoped for a partnership. Not simply a title and a household to manage, but genuine companionship, someone with whom I could share thoughts and observations, someone who valued my perspective, rather than simply my presence as a dutiful wife. And instead," Julian said quietly, "I gave you distance and silence." "Yes," Elena agreed simply, no bitterness in her tone, only quiet honesty. "You gave me distance and silence, and I told myself it was simply your nature. That perhaps I was expecting too much from a marriage, built on practical considerations, rather than deep affection, from the very beginning." Julian felt the weight of her words settling heavily upon him, understanding now with painful clarity how thoroughly he had failed to provide the partnership she had genuinely hoped for. "I am sorry that I gave you reason to lower your expectations so significantly," he said. "You deserved far better than the isolation I allowed to grow between us." Elena studied him for a long moment, something in her expression softening slightly, though her guard remained firmly in place. "What has changed, Julian? Why this sudden interest in understanding me, when months of marriage passed without any genuine effort on your part?" Julian considered the question carefully before answering. "My sister spoke with me plainly, reminding me that words and apologies mean little, without genuine understanding and change behind them. I realized, through speaking with those who know you well, how thoroughly I had failed to appreciate who you truly are. I do not expect this realization to immediately repair the damage I have caused, but I hoped that beginning to genuinely know you might represent an honest first step, rather than another empty gesture." Elena remained quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I appreciate your honesty," she said finally. "Though I must be clear with you, Julian. I am not prepared to simply return to our previous arrangement, nor am I prepared to pretend that trust has been restored, simply because we have had 2 conversations. Rebuilding what has been broken will require far more than words, however genuine they may currently seem." "I understand," Julian replied. "And I am prepared to demonstrate through actions, over whatever time is necessary, that I genuinely wish to build the kind of partnership you originally hoped for in our marriage." Their conversation continued for some time, touching on various topics that had never been properly discussed between them during their earlier months of marriage. Julian asked about her interests, her hopes for the future, her thoughts on managing their shared estate, and for the first time in their relationship, he listened genuinely to her responses, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. Elena, in turn, found herself cautiously opening up more than she had anticipated, though she remained careful to maintain appropriate boundaries, unwilling to fully trust that this shift in Julian's behavior represented lasting change rather than a temporary response to social pressure and damaged reputation. As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, Julian raised a matter he had been considering carefully in the days leading up to their conversation. I understand you have learned recently about your family's inheritance and the connections that come with your grandmother's lineage. I want to be clear that my renewed effort to understand you has nothing to do with that inheritance or those connections. I recognize how such a statement might sound suspicious given the timing, but I wanted to address it directly rather than allow the concern to linger unspoken between us. Elena studied him carefully, appreciating that he had raised the matter directly rather than allowing it to remain an unspoken source of doubt. I confess the timing has crossed my mind, she admitted honestly. It would be understandable for me to wonder whether your renewed interest stems from genuine growth or simply from learning that I am not the modest, unremarkable woman you once assumed me to be. I cannot prove my intentions through words alone, Julian said. I understand that only time and consistent action can demonstrate whether my change is genuine, but I wanted you to know that I have considered this concern myself, and I intend to prove through my continued behavior that my efforts are not motivated by your family's wealth or standing. Elena nodded slowly, neither fully accepting nor dismissing his words, choosing instead to reserve judgment until his actions could speak more clearly than any conversation might allow. Time will tell, Julian. For now, I appreciate that you have made an effort to genuinely engage with me today, rather than simply repeating apologies without substance behind them. As Julian prepared to depart, he paused at the doorway, turning back toward Elena one final time. May I ask permission to write to you again, simply to continue our conversation, without any expectation beyond genuine correspondence? Elena considered the request for a moment before nodding. You may write to me. I cannot promise how quickly I will respond, nor can I promise this will lead to any particular outcome, but I am willing to continue this conversation, provided it remains honest and free of pressure. Julian nodded, gratitude evident in his expression. That is all I ask for now. As he made his way back through the city streets toward his own residence, Julian felt a cautious sense of hope beginning to take root within him, tempered by the clear understanding that genuine reconciliation, if it were even possible, would require far more patience and consistent effort than he had initially anticipated. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time since the disastrous night of the ball, he felt he was finally taking steps in the right direction, guided not by concern for his own reputation, but by genuine desire to understand and appreciate the woman he had so carelessly overlooked for far too long. Weeks passed, following the second meeting between Julian and Elena, and during that time, a steady exchange of letters developed between them, each one adding another layer to the slowly rebuilding foundation of their relationship. Julian wrote regularly, sharing thoughts about estate matters, asking genuine questions about Elena's opinions on various decisions, and gradually revealing more of his own thoughts and vulnerabilities than he had ever shared with her during the earlier months of their marriage. Elena responded thoughtfully to each letter, though she maintained careful boundaries, unwilling to allow herself to become fully invested in the possibility of reconciliation until she felt genuinely confident that Julian's change represented lasting growth rather than a temporary reaction to social consequences. Still, with each exchange, she found herself softening slightly, recognizing genuine effort in his words that had been entirely absent during the earlier stages of their marriage. During this period, the wider social scandals surrounding their situation began to shift in tone as well. Where earlier gossip had focused almost entirely on mockery and speculation, a new narrative began to take shape, one that painted Elena in an increasingly favorable light, while continuing to hold Julian accountable for his earlier poor judgment. At a gathering hosted by Lady Hartley, Beatrice's mother, several prominent members of society found themselves discussing the matter over afternoon refreshments. I have heard the Duke has been making genuine efforts to reconcile with his wife, one guest remarked, sipping her tea thoughtfully. Writing to her regularly, seeking her counsel on estate matters, behaving quite differently than he did before this whole affair became public knowledge. It is remarkable how quickly a man can change his priorities, another guest replied with a knowing smile. Once he realizes the woman he dismissed carries far more influence and wealth than he initially assumed. The first guest shook her head slightly. Perhaps that is unfair. People do sometimes learn from their mistakes, given sufficient time and reflection. Perhaps, the second guest agreed, though skepticism remained evident in her tone. Though one must wonder whether his newfound appreciation would have developed at all, had the truth about her family never come to light. Such conversations continued throughout the city, opinions divided between those who believed Julian's growth genuine, and those who remained suspicious of his motivations. Elena, for her part, remained largely unaware of the full extent of these ongoing discussions, focused instead on her own careful process of determining whether the man corresponding with her through these letters truly represented meaningful change. One afternoon, as Elena sat reading Julian's latest letter in the quiet garden behind her grandmother's townhouse, Margaret approached and settled onto the bench beside her. "You seem thoughtful today," Margaret observed, noting the careful expression on her granddaughter's face. "Julian has asked whether I might consider visiting the estate," Elena said, setting the letter aside. "Not to return permanently, but simply to discuss matters relating to the household directly, rather than continuing our conversation solely through correspondence." Margaret studied her granddaughter carefully. "And what does your instinct tell you about this request?" Elena considered the question for a long moment, before answering. "I believe he is being sincere in his effort. His letters have revealed a thoughtfulness I never witnessed during our earlier months together. Yet I remain cautious, uncertain whether visiting the estate might place undue pressure on both of us to resolve matters more quickly than either of us has genuinely processed." "That is a wise concern," Margaret agreed. "Perhaps you might consider a compromise. A brief visit, with clear boundaries established beforehand, rather than an open-ended return that might create expectations neither of you are prepared to fulfill." Elena nodded slowly, appreciating her grandmother's practical wisdom. "I believe that could work. I will write to him and propose exactly that." Over the following days, Elena composed her response carefully, agreeing to a brief visit to the estate, while making clear that this did not represent a full reconciliation, but simply an opportunity to discuss practical matters in person, while continuing the slower process of rebuilding trust that their correspondence had begun. When Julian received her response, he felt a cautious relief mixed with renewed determination to demonstrate, during whatever time Elena allowed him, that his commitment to genuine change extended beyond mere words on paper. He spent the days leading up to her arrival, preparing carefully, reviewing estate matters that genuinely required her input, and resisting the urge to plan any grand gestures that might feel more like performance than authentic effort. The day of Elena's arrival brought a mixture of anticipation and nervousness for both parties. Julian waited at the entrance of the estate as her carriage approached, resisting the urge to rush forward, and instead allowing her the space to step down and enter at her own pace, exactly as she had requested in her letter. "Welcome back," Julian said simply, offering neither excessive warmth nor forced formality, striking a careful balance that reflected his growing understanding of the boundaries Elena had established. "Thank you," Elena replied, glancing around at the familiar grounds of the estate she had not seen in nearly 2 months. "It feels strange to be back here, though not unpleasant." Julian led her inside, and their conversation throughout the afternoon remained focused primarily on practical matters, exactly as Elena had requested. They discussed decisions regarding tenant farmers, upcoming seasonal preparations, and several household matters that had accumulated during her absence. Julian listened attentively to her suggestions, implementing several of her ideas without hesitation, demonstrating through his actions the respect for her judgment that had been so notably absent during the earlier months of their marriage. As the afternoon progressed into evening, their conversation gradually shifted from purely practical matters toward more personal topics, though Elena remained careful to maintain the boundaries she had established. She noticed, with quiet appreciation, that Julian did not push the conversation beyond what felt comfortable, allowing natural moments of connection to develop, rather than forcing intimacy that neither of them had genuinely earned back yet. Before her departure that evening, Julian walked Elena back toward her waiting carriage, the evening air cool and quiet around them. "Thank you for allowing this visit," he said sincerely. "I know it required considerable trust on your part, given everything that has happened between us." "I appreciate that you respected the boundaries I established," Elena replied. "It suggests genuine understanding, rather than simply agreement in words alone." As her carriage pulled away, Julian remained standing at the entrance of the estate, watching until the vehicle disappeared from view, a quiet sense of cautious hope settling within him. The path toward genuine reconciliation remained long and uncertain, but for the first time, since the disastrous events of the ball, he felt he was making authentic progress, built not on desperate attempts to salvage his reputation, but on genuine effort to understand and honor the woman he had so carelessly overlooked. Back at her grandmother's townhouse later that evening, Elena reflected on the day's events with a complicated mixture of emotions. She had witnessed genuine effort from Julian, consistency between his written words and his actions in person, and a respect for her boundaries that gave her cautious reason to believe genuine change might indeed be possible. Yet she remained careful not to allow herself to become fully convinced too quickly, understanding that true transformation required sustained effort over time, rather than a single successful visit. Margaret, sensing her granddaughter's contemplative mood, asked gently about how the visit had unfolded. "It went better than I expected," Elena admitted. "He listened carefully, respected the boundaries I set, and made genuine efforts to include my perspective in matters concerning the estate. I do not yet know if this represents lasting change, but it gives me reason for cautious hope." "That is all any of us can ask for in these situations," Margaret replied wisely. "Cautious hope, built gradually through consistent action, rather than immediate certainty based on a single encounter. Continue watching carefully, my dear, and trust your own judgment as this process continues to unfold." Elena nodded, understanding the wisdom in her grandmother's words, and settled into bed that evening, with thoughts of the future occupying her mind, uncertain exactly where this careful process of rebuilding might ultimately lead, but increasingly aware that whatever outcome awaited her, she would face it, having maintained her own dignity and boundaries throughout the entire difficult process. Several more weeks passed, during which Elena made a handful of additional visits to the estate, each one slightly longer than the last, as the careful process of rebuilding trust continued to develop between herself and Julian. During this time, Julian faced ongoing challenges as he worked to repair not only his marriage but the wider damage his earlier choices had caused to his standing among business associates and social connections throughout the city. One particularly difficult afternoon, Julian received an unexpected visit from Lord Pemberton, the very associate who had postponed their business meeting following the scandal at the ball. Julian greeted him cautiously, uncertain what purpose had brought the man to his study after weeks of distance. "Your Grace," Pemberton began formally, settling into a chair across from Julian's desk, "I have heard through various channels that you have been working diligently to repair matters with your wife, and that your efforts appear genuine, rather than simply performative." Julian nodded carefully, uncertain where the conversation might lead. "I have been trying, yes, though I do not claim to have fully succeeded yet." "I appreciate your honesty," Pemberton replied. "I confess, I withdrew from our planned business arrangement, partly out of concern regarding your judgment, given the manner in which the scandal unfolded. However, recent reports of your genuine efforts toward reconciliation have caused me to reconsider my earlier decision." Julian felt a cautious flicker of relief, though he remained careful not to appear overly eager. "I appreciate you sharing that with me directly, rather than simply allowing the matter to remain unaddressed." "I believe in giving people opportunities to demonstrate growth," Pemberton continued. "Though I must be clear, Your Grace, my willingness to reconsider our business arrangement depends entirely on continued evidence of your improved judgment, both in your marriage and in your broader conduct moving forward." "I understand completely," Julian replied, "and I am committed to demonstrating that improved judgment, not simply for the sake of business arrangements, but because I genuinely recognize the errors I made previously." Their conversation continued for some time, eventually leading to a tentative agreement to revisit their previous business discussions in the coming weeks, contingent upon continued positive developments in Julian's personal circumstances. After Pemberton's departure, Julian felt a renewed sense of determination, understanding that his efforts toward genuine change were beginning to yield tangible results beyond simply his relationship with Elena. Meanwhile, Elena continued her careful process of evaluation during her visits to the estate, noting with growing confidence that Julian's behavior remained consistent even when he believed she was not directly observing him. During one visit, she discovered him speaking kindly and respectfully with several estate workers, taking genuine interest in their concerns, rather than simply issuing commands, as he had often done previously. Such small moments of authentic character, witnessed without any expectation of her observation, gradually strengthened her belief that his growth extended beyond simple performance meant to win back her favor. During one such visit, as Elena walked through the estate gardens with Julian discussing plans for the coming season, she found herself asking a question that had lingered in her thoughts for some time. "Julian, I must ask you honestly, if the scandal at the ball had never occurred, if my family's inheritance had never come to light, do you believe you would have continued treating me the way you did before, hidden away and excluded from your public life?" Julian paused, considering the question carefully before answering, understanding that his response required complete honesty, rather than reassuring but hollow words. "I have asked myself that very question many times since these events unfolded," he said slowly. "And I believe, honestly, that without the painful consequences of that night, I likely would have continued the same patterns indefinitely, never questioning my own behavior or its impact upon you." Elena appreciated his honesty, though the answer carried its own difficult weight. "That is a painful thing to hear, though I respect that you did not offer false reassurance instead." "I believe you deserve complete honesty," Julian replied, "even when that honesty is uncomfortable. The truth is that it took public humiliation and genuine consequence for me to recognize my own failures. I wish I could claim I would have arrived at this same understanding through simple reflection alone, but I cannot honestly make that claim." Elena nodded slowly, processing his words. "I appreciate that honesty, Julian. It helps me understand more clearly the nature of the change you have undergone, and perhaps more importantly, the circumstances that made such change possible in the first place." Their conversation continued as they walked further through the gardens, touching on deeper questions about what genuine partnership might look like moving forward, questions that neither of them had properly considered during the earlier months of their marriage. Julian found himself sharing more vulnerable thoughts than he had ever expressed to another person, while Elena, in turn, allowed herself to share hopes and concerns she had long kept private, uncertain whether they would ever find a receptive audience within her own marriage. As their visit drew toward its conclusion that day, Elena paused near the estate's entrance, turning to face Julian directly. "I believe I am ready to consider a longer stay here at the estate," she said carefully. "Not a complete return to our previous arrangement, but perhaps an extended visit that allows us both to continue building whatever foundation might exist between us." Julian felt genuine hope rising within him at her words, though he was careful to contain his enthusiasm, understanding that pushing too eagerly might undermine the careful progress they had made thus far. "I would welcome that," he said simply, "and I will continue respecting whatever boundaries you feel necessary to establish during that time." Elena nodded, appreciating his measured response rather than an overwhelming display of excitement that might have felt premature, given the careful nature of their ongoing reconciliation. "I will discuss the details with my grandmother and make arrangements for an extended visit within the coming weeks." As Elena's carriage departed that evening, Julian remained standing at the estate's entrance for a long while, reflecting on how far their relationship had traveled since that disastrous night at the ball. The path had been difficult, filled with genuine consequence and painful self-reflection, but for the first time since the scandal had unfolded, he allowed himself to believe that a genuine and lasting reconciliation might indeed be possible, provided he continued the careful and consistent effort that had brought them to this current point. Word of the improving relationship between the Duke and Duchess gradually spread through the city's social circles as well, adding yet another layer to the ongoing narrative that had captivated society for months. Where earlier gossip had focused entirely on scandal and humiliation, conversations now increasingly turned toward genuine curiosity about whether the couple might successfully rebuild what had once seemed irreparably broken. At various social gatherings throughout the city, opinions remained divided, some skeptical of lasting change, others genuinely hopeful that the couple's continued efforts represented authentic growth rather than simple social performance. Regardless of the varying opinions, one truth remained consistent across every conversation. The story of the Duke, who had once been too embarrassed to bring his wife to the season's greatest event, had transformed into something far more complex and compelling than anyone could have initially predicted. A story of genuine consequence, difficult reflection, and the slow, careful process of rebuilding trust that had been so thoroughly broken through careless pride and thoughtless deception. Elena's extended visit to the estate began several weeks later, and with it came a new phase in the careful rebuilding of her relationship with Julian. Unlike her earlier brief visits, this extended stay allowed for a rhythm of daily life to develop between them, offering countless small opportunities for genuine connection that had been entirely absent during the earlier months of their marriage. During this period, Julian made deliberate efforts to include Elena in every aspect of estate management, seeking her counsel not as a formality, but as genuine partnership. He introduced her properly to important visitors, spoke of her accomplishments and insights with evident pride rather than the quiet embarrassment that had characterized his earlier behavior, and made clear through countless small actions that he no longer viewed her as someone to be hidden away from his public life. One afternoon, as autumn began settling over the countryside surrounding the estate, Julian received word that an important gathering would soon take place in the city, hosted by Lord Pemberton, to celebrate the renewal of their business partnership. Unlike the disastrous ball months earlier, Julian approached this invitation with an entirely different mindset. "I have received an invitation to Lord Pemberton's gathering next month," Julian told Elena over dinner one evening. "I would be honored if you would accompany me, properly introduced as my wife, with no secrets or hidden arrangements of any kind." Elena studied him carefully across the table, recognizing the significance of this moment, given everything that had transpired between them. "I would like that," she said finally, a genuine warmth entering her voice for the first time in many months, though I confess some nervousness, given how our last public appearance together unfolded so painfully. "I understand that concern completely," Julian replied, "and I promise you, this time will be entirely different. I intend to introduce you properly to everyone in attendance, to stand beside you throughout the evening, and to ensure that anyone who dares speak ill of you will understand clearly that such behavior will not be tolerated in my presence." Elena felt a genuine appreciation for his words, recognizing the significant distance he had traveled from the man who had once claimed she was too unwell to attend such gatherings. "Thank you, Julian. That means more to me than you likely realize." As the weeks progressed toward the gathering, both Julian and Elena found themselves growing increasingly comfortable in each other's company, their conversations flowing more naturally, their shared laughter becoming more frequent, and a genuine sense of partnership developing that neither of them had experienced during the earlier stages of their marriage. Elena found herself genuinely looking forward to their evening conversations, appreciating Julian's growing willingness to share his own thoughts and vulnerabilities, rather than maintaining the guarded distance he had once considered necessary. During this period, Julian also made efforts to reconnect with family members who had grown distant following the scandal. He wrote to his sister Charlotte, thanking her for the difficult but necessary honesty she had offered during their earlier conversation, and inviting her to visit the estate to witness firsthand the genuine progress he had made in his marriage. Charlotte arrived several weeks later, and her initial skepticism gradually softened as she observed the genuine warmth developing between her brother and his wife. During a quiet conversation with Elena one afternoon, Charlotte expressed her relief at the changes she witnessed. "I confess I doubted whether Julian possessed the capacity for genuine change," Charlotte admitted. "Yet seeing the two of you together now, I recognize something authentic in how he treats you, quite different from the careless distance he maintained previously." "It has been a difficult process," Elena replied honestly, "but I believe the effort has been genuine, and I am grateful for the role your honesty played in prompting that change." As the day of Lord Pemberton's gathering approached, Julian and Elena traveled together to the city, staying at Julian's townhouse, rather than separately, as they had during the earlier months of their marriage. The evening of the gathering arrived, and unlike the anxious tension that had characterized their preparation for the earlier ball, this time both Julian and Elena approached the event with a shared sense of calm confidence. Their carriage arrived at Lord Pemberton's estate, and Julian stepped down first, immediately turning to offer his hand to Elena, helping her from the carriage with evident care and attention. As they entered the grand hall together, Julian kept Elena close beside him, introducing her proudly to every guest they encountered, sharing genuine anecdotes about her intelligence and capability, rather than offering the vague excuses that had once characterized his behavior. Whispers followed them through the room, though this time the tone carried curiosity and admiration rather than mockery. Guests who had witnessed the earlier scandal watched with evident interest as the couple moved through the gathering together, clearly comfortable in each other's presence, their genuine connection evident to anyone paying attention. Lady Winslow, ever attentive to the social dynamics unfolding around her, approached the couple with evident curiosity. "Your Grace," she said, addressing Elena directly this time. "How wonderful to see you both here together this evening." "Thank you, Lady Winslow," Elena replied graciously, no trace of the earlier tension evident in her demeanor. "Julian and I have been looking forward to this evening together." Lady Winslow glanced between them, noting the genuine warmth passing between husband and wife, so different from the tension that had characterized their previous public encounter. "It seems much has changed since we last spoke, Your Grace." "Indeed it has," Julian replied, placing a gentle hand at Elena's back, a small gesture of genuine affection, rather than mere formality. "I have learned a great deal in recent months, lessons I intend to carry with me for the remainder of my life." As the evening progressed, Julian and Elena danced together, their movements comfortable and natural, a stark contrast to the careful distance they had maintained during the early months of their marriage. Guests throughout the hall observed the couple with growing admiration, many commenting quietly to one another about the genuine transformation that seemed to have occurred within their relationship. Camille, who had also received an invitation to the gathering, watched from a distance as Julian and Elena moved gracefully across the dance floor together. She felt a complicated mixture of emotions, recognizing that whatever brief arrangement had once existed between herself and Julian had been built on entirely different foundations than the genuine partnership now evident before her. She approached the couple briefly, during a quiet moment, offering a polite greeting. "Your Grace," she said, addressing Julian formally, "I am pleased to see matters have improved so significantly between yourself and the Duchess." Julian nodded politely, though his attention remained largely focused on Elena beside him. "Thank you, Camille. I hope you have been well since we last spoke." "I have been managing," Camille replied simply, before offering a brief, respectful nod toward Elena and moving away to rejoin other guests, understanding clearly that whatever role she had once played in this story had reached its natural conclusion. As the evening drew toward its close, Julian and Elena stepped outside, onto a quiet balcony overlooking the gardens below, taking a brief moment away from the crowded gathering to simply enjoy each other's company beneath the evening sky. "This evening has gone rather differently than our last public appearance together," Julian remarked with a small, genuine smile. "It has," Elena agreed, leaning slightly against the balcony railing as she gazed out at the peaceful gardens below. "I confess, I did not expect to feel so genuinely comfortable this evening, given everything that happened before." Julian turned to face her fully, his expression carrying a sincerity that Elena had come to recognize as genuine over the recent months of careful rebuilding between them. "I am grateful every day for your patience throughout this process, Elena. I know I did not deserve the opportunity to demonstrate genuine change, yet you offered me that opportunity regardless, and I intend to spend the rest of our lives together, proving that your patience was not misplaced." Elena studied him carefully beneath the soft evening light, recognizing in his words and his actions over recent months a genuine transformation that gave her cause for cautious optimism about the future they might yet build together. "I believe we still have much work ahead of us," she said honestly, "but I am willing to continue that work, provided you remain committed to the genuine partnership you have demonstrated in recent months." "I am completely committed," Julian replied firmly, "not out of fear of further scandal or damaged reputation, but because I have genuinely come to understand and appreciate the woman you truly are, far beyond the assumptions I once carelessly made about you." As they stood together beneath the evening sky, the distant sounds of music and laughter drifting from the gathering behind them, both Julian and Elena felt a genuine sense of hope for the future they were slowly, carefully building together, a partnership founded not on convenience or careless assumption, but on genuine understanding, respect, and the difficult but rewarding work of rebuilding trust that had once seemed entirely lost. Nearly a year had passed since the fateful night of the ball, and the city that had once buzzed endlessly with gossip about the Duke and his hidden wife had largely moved on to other matters of interest, as society inevitably does with the passage of time. Yet for Julian and Elena, the events of that year had left a lasting impact, shaping their marriage into something far stronger and more genuine than either of them could have imagined during those difficult early months. Elena had fully returned to the estate several months after Lord Pemberton's gathering, though her return came only after she felt genuinely confident that Julian's transformation represented lasting change, rather than temporary performance. Their marriage had settled into a rhythm built on genuine partnership, mutual respect, and open communication that had been entirely absent during the earlier period of their union. On a crisp autumn morning, nearly identical to the season when their story had first taken its dramatic turn, Julian sat with Elena in the estate's garden, reviewing plans for an upcoming gathering they intended to host together. Their first, as genuine partners, rather than as a duke, accompanied by a wife he had once considered an embarrassment. "I have been thinking," Elena said thoughtfully, setting aside the papers they had been reviewing, "about how different our lives have become since that difficult night. I wonder sometimes whether we would have ever found this genuine partnership without the painful consequences that forced us both to confront the truth of our situation." Julian considered her words carefully, understanding the complexity behind such a reflection. "I have wondered the same thing many times," he admitted. "I wish I could claim I would have found my way to genuine change without such painful consequence, but I know that would not be honest. The truth is that sometimes people require difficult lessons before they are willing to examine their own failures honestly." "I do not regret how things have unfolded," Elena said, "though I certainly would not wish to repeat that particular evening. Yet I recognize that the pain of that experience ultimately led us towards something far more genuine and lasting than what existed between us before." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Charlotte, who had become a frequent and welcome visitor to the estate in the months since her initial visit following the scandal. She approached with a warm smile, genuine affection evident in her greeting toward both her brother and his wife. "I have brought news," Charlotte announced, settling into a chair beside them. "Lord Pemberton has requested that Julian consider expanding their business partnership significantly, citing his confidence in Julian's improved judgment and character over the recent months." Julian felt a genuine sense of satisfaction at this news, recognizing it as further evidence of the tangible benefits that had emerged from his genuine efforts toward personal growth. "That is wonderful news," he replied. "Please extend my gratitude to Lord Pemberton, and let him know I would be honored to discuss the details further." As Charlotte shared additional updates about various family and business matters, Elena found herself reflecting on how thoroughly their circumstances had transformed since those difficult early days of scandal and uncertainty. The isolation and quiet unhappiness that had once characterized her marriage had given way to genuine partnership, mutual respect, and a deep affection that continued growing stronger with each passing month. Later that evening, after Charlotte's departure, Julian and Elena sat together in the estate's library, a quiet ritual they had developed over recent months, spending their evenings in comfortable companionship, sometimes discussing matters of importance, other times simply enjoying each other's presence in peaceful silence. "I received a letter today from my grandmother," Elena mentioned, setting aside the book she had been reading. "She writes that she is pleased to see how genuinely happy I have become, and that she considers this transformation in our marriage among the most rewarding developments she has witnessed in recent years." Julian smiled warmly at this news. "Your grandmother has been remarkably influential throughout this entire process. I owe her considerable gratitude for the wisdom and patience she offered you during the most difficult period of our marriage." "She has always believed in genuine strength over superficial appearances," Elena replied. "I believe that is precisely the lesson our entire experience has taught us both, in different ways." Julian reached across the small distance between them, taking Elena's hand gently in his own, a simple gesture that carried far more genuine affection than any of the elaborate displays he might have once considered necessary to demonstrate his feelings. "I am endlessly grateful that you allowed me the opportunity to learn that lesson, Elena. Despite how thoroughly I failed you during the earlier months of our marriage, I do not take your patience and forgiveness for granted, and I intend to spend every remaining year of our marriage proving worthy of the trust you have extended to me." Elena squeezed his hand gently, genuine warmth evident in her expression. "We have both grown considerably through this difficult experience, Julian. I believe that growth has made us stronger, both individually and as partners, than we ever could have become had that painful night at the ball never occurred." As the evening settled peacefully around them, the quiet crackling of the fireplace, providing gentle warmth against the cooling autumn air outside, both Julian and Elena felt genuine contentment with the life they had built together. A life founded not on pride, assumption, or careless disregard, but on honesty, patience, and the willingness to confront difficult truths in pursuit of something genuinely lasting and meaningful. Their story, once the subject of scandalous gossip whispered through every drawing room and social gathering across the city, had ultimately transformed into something far more profound than anyone observing that painful night at the ball could have possibly predicted. It had become a story, not of humiliation and scandal, but of genuine growth, difficult but necessary reflection, and the enduring strength of a woman who had refused to allow herself to be dismissed or hidden away, insisting instead upon being seen, valued, and respected exactly as she deserved. And as the seasons continued their steady turn, bringing new challenges and new joys to the estate they now shared as genuine partners, both Julian and Elena carried with them the hard-won understanding that the truest measure of character lies not in avoiding mistakes entirely, but in the courage to acknowledge those mistakes honestly, and the genuine commitment to change that follows in their wake. Their marriage, once nearly destroyed by pride and careless assumption, had ultimately become a testament to the possibility of genuine transformation, built patiently and honestly, one careful step at a time, until what had once been broken had become something entirely new, strong, and enduring in its own right.